I'd first like to thank Maria and Mario for having me here. It's very kind. And the second thing is, I naturally speak quite quietly, so if at any point you can't hear what I'm saying, just tell me to speak up and I'll forget. I'd like to begin with a question. Are we experiencing a legal turn? On one hand, I hope the answer is no, because to proclaim any kind of historiographical turn is generally to also proclaim its death. But on the other hand, it's remarkable how in the last decade or so, medieval historians of all kinds paid increasing attention to the relationship between legal documents and the society from which they came. This trend has been dubbed by both Anthony Musson and Shannon McSheffrey as New Legal History. New legal historians, I would say, are interested in the discursive aspects of texts, in expanding the range of what has been traditionally considered legal, in examining the relationship between the courtroom and the rest of society, and to some extent in rewriting the social and legal history as a result. Of course, the label new here depends largely on how we interpret our historiographical lineage. F.W. Maitland, one of the greatest English legal historians, was certainly interested in the relationship between society and law. And historians have been alive to the discursive aspects of all kinds of texts since the late 1980s. But nonetheless, I do think we're experiencing something of a moment. The inclusion of the word culture in the title of a legal history conference now seems perfectly straightforward in a way that it might not have done so a decade ago. Perhaps that is the best measure of how far we have turned to the legal. And of course, as with other terms, I'm thinking here especially the spatial and emotional terms as well, historians, and medievalists in particular, have frequently had recourse to theories from other humanities, notably anthropology. In this paper, I would like to consider some of the ways in which medieval historians have treated the broad theme of law and culture, with attention to those who have found legal anthropology a useful tool for thinking about this issue. I would also like to mention some of the problems of these approaches, and how they can be overcome. But my overall aim is not just to review the historiography. I would also like to build towards a workable definition of juridical culture, at least as I recognise it. I look forward to seeing how this set of papers Professor Branco has brought here together will help to refine and possibly redefine the interpretation I put before you now. Firstly, a very rough and abbreviated account of legal anthropology. Genealogies of the discipline sometimes stretch back to Aristotle and Hobbes, and very often to early Victorian outliers. And most people agree that Bronislaw Malinowski was the founding father of modern legal anthropology. He was certainly the one who instituted a call for its establishment as an area of ethnographic study. His foundational work was Crime and Law in Savage Society, and it's influential to this day. He's rather the Maitland of anthropology. In this book, he set out to find all those rules that acted as binding obligations in the ordinary lives of the Trobriand people. He thus figured a sense of law based around social behaviour. This was in stark contrast to previous and indeed some subsequent attempts in legal anthropology to characterise the law of other cultures, particularly those of Africa and South Asia, with reference to Anglo-American legal categories, such as the precedent-oriented nature of common law. This latter approach, focusing on the rules, is generally referred to as a rule-centred conception. These approaches stemming from Malinowski's ideas, called processual. On the one hand, the rule-centred school was criticised by people such as Paul Berhanon in the 50s, who argued that it was ethically and theoretically unsound to impose Western legal categories on traditional societies. On the other hand, proponents of the rule-centred approach argued that it was only with modern Western legal categories that useful ethnographic comparisons could be made. These debates seem to me rather euphemistic in retrospect, because what was really at issue here was whether law is made up of rules that are imposed top-down, or whether it is the processes that stem organically from social dispute. The pioneering and influential work of John Comaroff and Simon Roberts changed the terms and direction of this debate in the early 80s. They co-authored a book which was called Rules and Processes, which was published in 1981. They argued forcefully that neither a rule-centred nor processual approach fully explain the juridical culture of the Tswana people of southern Africa, whom they presented as their case study. They're quite elegant solutions to force the two halves of the rules and processes dichotomy together, arguing that there are rules that govern the dispute processes. These rules are not legal, but cultural in nature. Their book was subtitled The Cultural Logic of Dispute. In a broader anthropological context, this idea is quite close to Clifford Geertz's ideas about the interpretation of cultures. These are well known to medievalists in the form of the famous essay on Balinese cockfighting. And although I don't have time to go into it here, this was of course also roughly the same moment as Pierre Bourdieu's monumental Outline of the Theory of Practice, which was translated into English in 1977. Scholars in all areas of the humanities were trying to reconcile the relationship between practice and structures. Roberts and Komaroff's neat analysis did exactly that, as it provided a way to think about dispute processes and link them to cultural rules. And indeed it proved immediately relevant to social historians who were beginning to confront the fact that most of their sources were legal documents. Firstly, in 1983, John Bossy edited a collection of essays called Dispute Settlement, Law and Human Relations in the West, which spanned the 6th to the 17th centuries, and included a useful explanatory essay from Simon Roberts on anthropological theory. Second, but probably more influential, was The Settlement of Disputes in Early Medieval Europe, published in 1986. Production of the so-called Bucknell group of early medievalists, including Wendy Davis, Chris Wickham, and the late Patrick Cornwall. This book had a more specific focus on the pre-millennium world, and a more coherent goal, to demonstrate the complexity, and above all, the orderliness of early medieval society. Both of these books, though, were written by social historians with an interest in law, rather than legal historians with an interest in society, and both engaged explicitly with the dispute settlement theory of Roberts and Komaroff. They aimed to show that a lack of courts did not mean that society was anarchic, or that lawmakers ruled arbitrarily, that there were sophisticated social processes that governed legal decisions and practices, and that the rules of these functional processes could tell historians something fundamental about societal and cultural norms, or habitus, to use Bourdieu's term. Previous work that considered law and society had been much more concerned, in general, with measuring the effectiveness of central institutions in producing an orderly society. This was famously true of my own subject of expertise, England in the 15th century. The significance of these two books, then, on dispute settlement, was to shift the focus from institutions to people, and to understand formal law as just one part of the resolution of conflict. In the words of the Bucknell group, going to court often fitted into a set of wider social strategies for each party. At the least, the court case was only one part of the dispute and its settlement. This theory has been central to the work of some extremely important historians such as E.P. Thompson, working in the 18th century, Chris Wickham, Paul Hines, Wendy Davis, I could go on. There are nonetheless problems with this theory, which I think can be divided into three main points. Firstly, the dispute settlement theory posits that human society is fundamentally fractious. Wickham conceives this in terms of class struggle, while Hines sees vengeance as a cultural trope in the West, and Daniel Lord Smale, in his book The Consumption of Justice, which is about 14th century Marseille, simply says that competitive tension is inherent in all societies. Regardless of my own opinion on this subject, I do not think that such assumptions should have such a strong supporting role in the formulation of historical arguments. They've also led to some questionable conclusions. When conflict is assumed, historical instances of social harmony or conflict movements tend to be treated as aspects of a self-interested strategy that aims at maximizing individual gain, rather than taking seriously its genuine needs and strategies in court. I know of a case in the London church courts, for instance, in which a man, not the plaintiff or the defendant, I should point out, who consistently tries to circumvent both social and legal conflict whilst pursuing his own goals. But the case ends up in court for reasons beyond his control. If we see society as essentially ridden with conflict, we lose some of the nuance of this kind of social negotiation. This leads straight to my second criticism. The assumption of conflict and the focus on the methods used to deal with it can sometimes have the effect of reducing different kinds of law courts to mere forums for dispute settlement. For instance, commenting on the decision of 12th century Pisans to use courts of Roman law as opposed to their traditional customary legal fora, Chris Wickham argues that all they were really doing was adopting a complicated ritual, a complex set of procedures, as he says, whose whole dramatic logic was directed towards the resolution of disputes inside the framework of the institutions of the court. On one level, the jus civilis was indeed just a complex set of procedures with a great deal of drama. But it was by its very nature qualitatively different from the customary law that the peasants had used before, even if, as Wickham contends, it shared some of the same assumptions. To put this in the terms of Robertson Komarov, Roman law was rooted in a different cultural logic. If there are analytic gains to be made by blurring the boundaries between different systems of dispute resolution, something is nevertheless lost by comparing them as like with like. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the theory of dispute settled posits that law is something ontologically different from society. This is at the very heart of the analysis of Komarov and Roberts, and the historians who followed their lead. As I said earlier, this attempt to link society and law was located within a broader effort from the humanities to understand the way that human praxis, behaviour, the social, is linked to cultural structures of thought. Chris Wickham and E.P. Thompson in particular use Bourdieuian or Bourdieu-esque theory to bridge the gap between these two categories. I'm not convinced by the distinction, however, especially in light of recent critiques of Bourdieu coming from the social sciences. I'm here very influenced by the work of Bruno Latour, a French thinker who makes a case against using society as a sphere in which other things happen, such as economics, culture, and indeed law. He argues, on the contrary, that society is not itself an actor in history, that is, it does not have a causative effect because it is not a thing at all. Rather, it is the sum total of social relations. I find this account compelling insofar as it applies to the theory of dispute settlement, because it changes the way that we ought to read our sources. If we cannot conceive society as an abstract sphere, then it follows that we cannot conceive of it as possessing a cultural logic in any straightforward way. Of course, none of these historians of dispute settlement are amateurs who believe that what they read in the Charter is exactly what happened. All of them clearly understand that a legal document is a formulaic, discursive construction, insofar as it presents the facts. But I think that the attempt to look for the social in legal documents is doomed to failure, because the presentation of the social is every bit as discursive as the witness lists or symbolic gestures. Medieval legal documents had an interest in demonstrating reconciliation, in showing that they are producing harmony and resolving disputes. These claims served a clear ideological function. It thus seems to me somewhat simplistic to see the cultural logic they present in support of such claims as any less constructive than the actual social processes presented therein. Charters, witness depositions, and bills of complaint are not symptomatic of some abstract society occurring elsewhere. They are the instances we have of a certain kind of relationship between medieval people. We must therefore be much more critical of the particular way that legal documents frame the social relationships that produce them. So where does this leave a definition of juridical culture, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about? I think the most important lesson to be learned from this critique of dispute settlement is that we need some way to talk about law without comparing it against or measuring it, comparing it with or measuring it against things called society and culture. They have to stand together. But of course, we're presented with the timeless problem, what is law? A legal anthropologist named Brian Tamanaha wrote recently that since the mid-1980s, philosophers of jurisprudence have not only given up trying to define law, but generally now consider the task itself to be impossible. That really ought to be enough to persuade me not to have a go, but I'm going to anyway. My suspicion, influenced as it is by recent approaches in legal anthropology, is that the problem lies with looking at law as a bounded thing, like we've done with society. Law does not work very well as a category for spheres of human action and thought, because the parameters here are boundless. You can imagine law as a balloon bursting with all of the meanings that we try and load into it. A much better way of thinking about law, I would contend, is to see it as a mediator, something that lies in between other things, whether people, other categories, or objects. It provides a language with which to talk about certain kinds of relationships. That is, as I will come on to, why it makes such an excellent adjective as legal or juridical for other things, like culture. But to stay with the idea of law being in between, I'd like to mention the ideas of David Delany, a legal geographer. He talks about law as something that happens at a particular time in a particular space. is closely wedded to the idea of law as a mediator, as it gets at the sense that the relationships it describes are contingent on other kinds of interactions taking place in space and time. For example, if I go walking in the countryside and encounter a barbed wire fence blocking my path, we can see the laws of private property, the laws of freedom of passage, potentially the law of trespass, all happening on some level in the instance of my relationship to the fence itself, and the field I'm blocked from, and the signification of the barbed wire. Seeing law as something that happens allows us to think about the relationships between praxis, in me encountering these things, social structures, in the fact that I am prohibited from going further, and discourse, in the set of signals I receive from the barbed wire. The idea of law mediating relationships, or the idea of it happening at the intersection of those relationships, provides an analytic framework for confronting the fact that, as E.P. Thompson famously put it, law is at every bloody level. On the other hand, it is a theoretical and perhaps slightly abstruse approach, and you're of course free to disagree with it. But I would nonetheless like to extend this idea a little further into its implications for juridical culture. I do not think it is contentious to say that in general we should interpret this term as widely as possible. For instance, I would include the study of scribal formula in inquisitors' handbooks under the rubric of juridical culture, or that of legal motifs in merchant class literature. These are part of culture in obvious ways. And moreover, I would include work that is concerned with social processes and ideologies, studies of the way that certain spaces, emotions, genders, and so forth were demarcated by legal actions and discourses. I opt for this kind of inclusivity, not only because I have learned a great deal from people also working in this broad field, whose work is ostensibly nothing to do with my own, but also because it is important that historians interested in law, not just legal historians, can positively influence the work by social, cultural, and political historians. So we come back once more to the idea of a legal term. But where do we draw the disciplinary boundary? Was medieval culture saturated with legal ways of thinking? Or was medieval law characterized by its engagement with other cultures? The answer is both, which probably indicates that the questions are badly framed. I think it would be better to ask, in what ways did medieval relationships between people, things, and categories use law as a descriptive language? That is, what were the conditions necessary for law to happen? As these questions perhaps suggest, I would like to characterize juridical culture in a way that directly stems from my conception of law. In short, I see it as a kind of network, representing the meanings and processes of law mediated between other things. I do not wish... Sorry, yes. It is a kind of a key point. What is juridical culture? I see juridical culture as a kind of network representing the way that meanings and processes of law mediated between other things. I do not wish the word network here to imply a static or immutable network, like a join dots on a piece of paper. Rather, I think we can compare it to a mobile phone network. A mobile network is constantly changing in relation to itself as new people join the network by buying phones and other people leave it by getting rid of their phones. It's also changing in relation to the people themselves who use it as they wander in and out of mobile signal, closer or further to the communications tower. So it was, I think, with juridical culture in medieval Europe. People in certain situations have varying amounts of signal strength with regards to law, but it was quite difficult, perhaps impossible, to find a place in which the diverse meanings of law played no role in mediating between people and the physical environment, objects and ideas and so forth. It's difficult to be out of range. So the gauntlet is laid down. I hope that you will not see this definition as an unbending rule imposed from on high, and that any disputes we have can be resolved amicably.
Thank you very much. I was considering how this mobile phone metaphor would work in Portuguese. In Portugal, where the phones actually are one of the few things that work very well, and everybody can connect, but so getting out of range is actually difficult. I would like to launch the debate, so any questions, comments that you might have? I know this was a dense considerations. Thank you very much for that. But, yes.
Well, I have one. You talked about the juridical culture, the law being in the process, like the mediation, and to try to see, to ascertain a different kind of relations between the person and its environment. From what is being done, which examples of this mediation have been studied until now? In terms of, you talked about geographical, was the one of the
Yeah, so there are...
and what the results?
Yeah.
If you can...
There are a set of they were legal anthropologists who got interested in space as a category. They're generally modernists. So there's quite a lot of medieval work which considers space. There's not very much medieval work which considers space and law as independent categories, aside from the work of Daniel Smale, his book Imaginary Cartographies. Law as mediation comes from David Delaney and another guy called Nicholas Blomley. Nicholas Blomley has written a book about it recently, in which he talks about modern Canada and the way that a bureaucratic idea of flow means that people should be able to walk down a pavement without anything blocking their path. And he says that because pavements are designed by civil engineers, and there's nothing really very political about pavements, we nonetheless get political issues involved in what's on the pavements, because you have homeless people, prostitutes, various other things that like protests and that sort of thing. Pavements are political, and yet they're designed by people who refuse to accept that they are. And so he talks about the ways that talks about the interface between a pavement being a pavement and a pavement with a homeless person on it, or a prostitute or whatever, which constitutes an issue, and suddenly the law stretches and becomes an issue. So that's the way I sort of think about the way that law is mediating these relationships. It's sort of everywhere and nowhere.
Yes. I would like just to say, if someone feels more comfortable in speaking in Spanish, all the English people on the table understand Spanish too, so questions can be put in Spanish and will be answered in English.
Or even in Portuguese, we can.
Yes. I would like to... I have to thank you again. I thought this was brilliant, and it was a difficult topic, and we all know that, but that's why what about... I agree with most of what you say, but what about the process of authorizing law? I mean, yes, a mediator, but in each of the sides, how do you get the mediation to assert itself as recognizably imposing itself? And this brings us to the question of customs and law, and how they also had clashes in between them. And I would like to know how you feel about that. I mean, I think the problem about the conflict-solving ideology, so to speak, is precisely that it sort of tries to recognize the beginnings of how rules become authoritative and how they then develop. And of course, then the whole thing gets so complex.
No, I agree that that's a big problem. I think when I'm talking about mediation, I don't want to sort of imply as just a link, as it were. That's why the mobile phone metaphor isn't any good, because there's nothing ideological about having a mobile phone, really. But I think if we take a very political, possibly Marxist approach to these things, all human relationships are power relationships. So the theory can possibly handle that strain in that we can just say that it's implied that those relationships are never necessarily equal, but law is more or less in between. But I agree that what it doesn't explain very well is sovereignty and central power and how those things are extended. So the answer is I don't know.
Well, which is good. So we have things to think about. I think this question about the whole the law, I agree it's difficult, impossible to define, but the ways in which people actually feel compelled to accept that there are norms widely accepted by communities, then get in a way widened and in another way shortened. It's quite interesting because you have customary law. We think we know where it comes from. Then you have law from above, as you said. How is that implemented? And then you have the central law, charters of privilege, pluralism for us, and how many communities accept and receive all those mediators, but very imposing mediators.
Another development in legal anthropology, which has not been so influential for legalists, I think, has been legal pluralism, which is the idea not just that we should consider different kinds of formal law, like canon law or customary law and so on, but actually all kinds of social control. So that would include like the rules of a game or the rules of a university, and that all of these things are tying us down the whole time. This is quite a lot of early modernists. Yeah, you come back to habitus. Well, I prefer the habitus way of thinking about things, just because if we see too many rules, then we end up seeing human beings as very constrained in a way that we don't really think of ourselves as being. So I'm not sure whether it works so well. Early modernists are very important out there.
All right, any further? The conflict-solving man has nothing to say?
I have a question actually. Sorry.
Yes.
When one talks about the field of the arts, one tends to talk mostly about the field of the arts in your own academic milieu, which we always do. So you have mentioned some French scholars, you mentioned Malinowski. What about the Germans and the Italians? If you try to broaden it, including other academic traditions, how would the field look like?
I think, as I was just saying, about social control has been very influential for Germans. I mean, they've got Weber, the king of social control, and also Elias. And I suppose from a German-speaking tradition, Buxinger as well. It's Dutch. I can't tell the difference. I think certainly you can discern that in the German school of historiography. But this is coming from historians who are interested in the Reformation and how we can explain massive religious change and the apparently increasing regulation of human behaviour in the 16th century. I think that's easier to see in the time period rather than because English historians are doing something. Italian scholarship, I don't read Italian, I'm ignorant. I just apologise, I don't know the scholarship well enough to comment.
Is there any sort of integration? There are common forums in which people from Germany, Italian, England, the States, or they meet together so that there can be. You see, I'm asking this because from a Spanish point of view, and also because of our own history, we've been very isolated. We had 40 years of dictatorship. So we don't have really a tradition, or we have an interruptus tradition to which is very difficult to relate. So we tend to read the scholarship written by English, by the Germans, by the Italians, by the French. And when we read that as outsiders, what we see is that the English, there are very few scholars who really cross boundaries between academic milieus. you can see that very well from the outside, not so much from the inside. So Bourdieu, Elias, Weber, of course, are everywhere. But then there are developments within each scholarly tradition that very a lot of difficulties, and it takes a lot of time to cross boundaries. And I was wondering if there is any kind of association of legal historians dealing with law that meet, so that the things that are happening at the same time, because this is a growing field, can meet together and exchange views and see what. I don't know if I'm.
There is, yeah. So there's an organisation. They're actually having a conference in Birkbeck next year, which I should advertise. It's nothing to do with Birkbeck. They just happen to be holding it at Birkbeck, and it's called the American Association for the Law, Culture, and the Humanities. So it's not history; it's a broad way of, it's sort of a legal social science approach. And they're very interesting because they tend not to be historians, they tend to be cultural theorists and social scientists and anthropologists. I think within history, the problem has been that so often we borrow from other disciplines. This historical moment when we started borrowing from legal anthropology produced brilliant work which has become so influential. I mentioned Chris Wick and Wendy Davis and so on, they're very recognizable names, but when you read work by postgraduate historians and people who've published little articles and books and they disappear, they're influenced by this history. It's very, it's important stuff. But then people don't keep up with the debates from where they borrowed. Legal anthropology, they're not interested in this anymore. They're interested in space, they're interested in emotions and psychology and the crazy stuff, but which wouldn't necessarily be relevant to historians. But I think one of the big problems is that if we're going to borrow from other disciplines, we need to engage, as you say, in a wider culture of humanities. Because the trend is towards a heterogeneization rather than people actually speaking to each other. I think Chris Wickham actually says in his book Courts of Conflict that he's doing this not as just a study of 12th century Italy, but because he believes that history is something which can tell anthropologists something about another human society. I think that's just a great message. I think that's what we should be doing the whole time, talking to other people in other disciplines. And yeah.
Yes, I think also that it's true that each case is often a case, and so from diversity comes not one model, not one way of doing things, not one way of looking at things, and so at a certain point you had this expression that actually meant this widening of the subject into many sub-subjects, because like the past, I agree with the past, go to London sidewalk or come to the Calçada Portuguesa, and we have a totally different reality. We were talking about it yesterday. So yes, the same thing could apply to the juridical world, so to speak, the juridical cultures and the different, the extraordinary wide range of people involved and the level of commitment in their involvement in processes that are legal or political or whatever. And we may very well end up in this twirling vortex where everything is law and everything is politics and everything is society. Andrea, would you like to say something?
Well, yes. Just a short note. I thought this idea of mediation very attractive, obviously, and I've been studying space, one of those strange things, and I myself find it very attractive as well. All these terms have a lot in common, but when it comes to the what you call the settlement of dispute theory, I think, or when it comes to the early Middle Ages, and you've cited the work of Wickham, but that book is about the 12th century. I mean, the pre-12th century period is a different thing in many regards, I think.
So I was referring to his later book, Courts of Conflict, but also he wasn't involved with the first book.
Yes, I know.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But I think there's a lot of work on settlement of disputes and more recent work than book published in 1986 has come to incorporate a lot of anthropological thinking. And in fact, when you look at the ways these people describe settling disputes in the 9th, the 10th, the 11th centuries, the problem here is probably law. I mean, there is a lot of intertwining between society and juridical culture in the broadest sense. When these disputes are being settled, law, wherever this means, is acting upon society, and the social structures are at the same time modeling law. I mean, this is not a very top-down enforcement of law. So I think perhaps this division, what you call the ontological division between law and society, may not apply so easily to these early medieval.
No, I totally agree. I mean, maybe I expressed myself badly. My point wasn't that this is what I was trying to do with the idea of mediation. Because they have a very sophisticated concept of law, which is, as you say, something where you have society modelling law and law modelling society. My problem with that is that if we separate them into different categories, then you create this world of problems for yourself analytically. If we just say the word, by just saying the word society and law, we're making a distinction between them. Whereas the reality, as you say, was more mixed. So I think mediation is a way of talking about that mix, rather than separating them out in our heads.
I understand, but we need words and we need concepts in order to think reality, right? You can not just avoid them. I mean, this is a tough discussion, but we need them.
Yeah.
And probably these charters and this period is particularly interesting for analyzing that mediation process. I mean, because we have a very blurred image of law by this time, which again from the 12th century onwards becomes more clear or more distinguishable.
No, I would agree with that.